Thank you very much indeed. I hope you can hear me well. It is a privilege and an honor to say a few words at your conference. It is extremely important, as I'm sure all of you pointed out already, to continue to discuss the medical and the legal aspects related to ethics, but at the same time, to remember to fight against the loss of memory and what it meant for so many of us whose families come from East Central Europe and what the Holocaust caused for hundreds and thousands and millions of people. And to look back now and reflect historically and critically and emotionally is extremely important, not just for us, those who still remember our grandparents, but also for younger generations. And to be able to say a few words about eugenics in this context, I think is very important. Because as you know, we defeated Nazism in 1945, but we did not defeat racism or anti-Semitism or eugenics. And notwithstanding how important the Nuremberg Code is in establishing the boundaries of research in terms of ethics and how to set the agenda for future discussion of medical and legal aspects related to medical experiments. The Nuremberg Code did not condemn eugenics properly, did not condemn eugenic physicians, which of course caused a serious issue in terms of the legacies of that type of thinking that was so prominent in Nazi Germany and actually led to atrocities pursued in the name of science and carried out by people trained as physicians. In other words, people trained to save human life. So although I have only 15 minutes or so, I will try to say a few reflective words, some commentaries I have about this, and hopefully this will fit well with the purpose of your conference. Now, as you know, when people hear today about eugenics, they become alarmed and distraught in a way. And this is justifiable because if we look at the historical facts, we understand this reaction. In the name of eugenics, hundreds of thousands of people were institutionalized and sterilized. Euthanasia was performed on children and adults with disabilities, and unethical human experiments were conducted in Nazi concentration camps. At the same time, sexual minorities were targeted, and their lives were constantly supervised. Furthermore, socially disadvantaged people were believed to be defective and unfit. They were described as biologically unworthy of reproduction. And any inventory of the abusive acts committed in the name of eugenics will be incomplete without mentioning indigenous people across the world who were subjected to humiliating racial research to evidence their assumed inferiority. The practice also extended to ethnic minorities in Europe, such as the Roma. As a self-styled scientific theory of human betterment and plant breeding, the main purpose of eugenics was to improve the genetic quality of the human population through the control of reproduction, and at its extremes, through the elimination of those who were considered hereditarily tainted. If a person was considered unfit, either due to their physical or mental disabilities, or because of their social and ethnic origins, that placed them in less privileged positions. And they were targeted by racists and by anti-Semites and by eugenicists, irrespective of how old or young they were, or whether they were male or female. The individual who was eugenically stigmatized in this way was an individual whose biological and social identity was called into question every time he or she or they walked onto the street. In the name of common good, or in the name of the nation, it was therefore necessary for the unfit, for those different, to be weeded out, or at least excluded from the normal rhythm of society. These individuals were continuously marginalized and mistreated, if we look at what happened in the interwar period in East Central Europe, with the emergence of racial anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic laws being introduced in a number of countries, Hungary, then independent state of Croatia, then Romania in the late 1930s, early 40s. And their difference was repeatedly reinforced through this racist legislation, but also through state-sanctioned policies of institutionalization, segregation, stigmatization, and ultimately deportation and elimination. The Nazi eugenic and racial program of extermination to purify what they called the race of its undesired members was certainly the most extreme form of eugenics, paving the way to the Holocaust and to the death of around 11 million people, of whom 6 million of them were Jews. Now, one persistent interpretation describes the rise and fall of eugenics through the lens of Nazi racial state. And a lot of the scholarship, at least in medical history and biomedicine, that deals with medicine under Nazis or with Nazi medicine, was for a long time described as pseudoscience, which allowed, in a way, these people to kind of be exonerated somehow because they were considered either non-representative of the overall German science or overall medicine in the global sense, or they were considered to be extreme cases, fanatic Nazis who were completely brainwashed ideologically. And that was an interpretation that worked as well in respect to eugenics, assuming that there's only one particular form of eugenics that was carried out by these people, rather than understanding eugenics more broadly as part and parcel of a scientific attempt to control and manage population, and understanding its all full racial connotations. And of course, after 1945, I mentioned already the Nuremberg Code and the trials that followed the defeat of Nazism. There was an attempt, of course, to separate, in a way, good science from bad science, to separate those who were ideologically tainted from those who resisted or, in a way, opposed forms of racism and eugenics. However, no one questioned at the time their scientific worldview, their scientific views, was in a way very eugenically based. And in the 1950s, when the UNESCO decides to issue the statement of race, we could see that the attempt to get rid of race science in the way it was practiced in Europe and in America until the 1950s or late 1940s didn't necessarily work out, although, of course, many scientists agreed and signed the declaration. There were other very prominent scientists who refused to sign that, still believing that race is a biological category, not a social or a cultural or religious construction, but it is a biological category and it retains some importance, which is fine. And maybe that in itself would deserve a different talk. I just want to highlight that in connection to the universal condemnation of eugenics, because the assumption is that after 1945, we got rid of it. Certainly in Germany, it did not become possible to speak of eugenics after 1945. And through the process of denazification, of course, some of extreme forms of racist eugenics and racial hygiene were put aside. But the eugenic understanding of the world remained very persistent, not only in Europe, but across the world in the 1950s and 60s. Major eugenic societies, including the one in Britain, the Eugenic Society in Britain, did not change its name, remained the Eugenic Societies until 1969. The same in the United States, where the Eugenic Society continued to function until 1972. And I always think of this metaphor, if you think of that flower, that dandelion flower, that you blow all the petals, but like the seeds remain, and the wind takes the seed and carries it across, and then it plants somewhere and it grows again. It was the same in eugenics. After 1945, we got rid of its Nazi connotations, but the seed continued to travel and it found very fertile soil elsewhere And scientists and experts around the world continue in the post-war period to cultivate it. Now, of course, as many of you know, eugenics did not originate in Nazi Germany, or even in Germany for that matter, but it is connected so strongly and clearly with Nazi Germany. And most people, if you ask them on the street, what do you know about eugenics? So if you go around in London, or I suppose will be the same in other parts of the world, they will tell you, they will talk about the Nazi programs of compulsory sterilization and human experimentation and euthanasia. And it's true that the Nazi Germany's eugenic determination to purify the race really astonishes us to this day, with its combination of sheer brutality, unethical research, careful planning, both by political leaders and by scientists, and still very problematic to many in Europe, public support. We shouldn't forget that there was a lot of public support for lots of these eugenic programs, and not only in Nazi Germany. I also want to point out that people tend to speak about eugenics, sometimes correctly, as in the scientific way or a scientific program, in a way downplaying the social or the political motivation behind eugenics. And I think this is not necessarily correct and historically fair, because anti-Semitism, racism, and eugenics were closely intertwined. And if we look at Nazi Germany, surely we'll all understand why. But if we looked at eugenics through the anti-Semitic thinking of the time, so if you look at 1930s, 1940s, we hear this all over Europe, and particularly in Germany, of course, that the nations or the race is under threat. It's this constant threat of degeneration, and people need to be protected. The majority, as it were, needs to be protected. And this is on two levels. Either they were talking about the Jews, and mixing with the Jews was considered to be eugenically detrimental to the nation, or simply considered to be because they were deemed to be as an inferior, and it was described to be a threat on one level. So you have this profound anti-Semitic racist rhetoric that comes all the time in the medical and scientific discussion about careful planning or eugenic optimization of the people. But at the same time, you have another logic, of course, which is about the internal cleansing of its own population of people they didn't want and desired. And we could see this with the euthanasia program when it started. Because obviously at first they went after people with disabilities, and they were not, there were people who were, at least in terms of their citizenship and nationality, were considered to be Germans. So we have to keep this in mind when we talk about the development of medical and legal aspects of ethics after 1945, we need to remember and clearly contextualize this very complex history of eugenics that happened between the interwar period and particularly during the 1930s in Central and Eastern Europe and in Nazi Germany. Because it is during this period that eugenics connected the notion of what they call collective welfare with the individual responsibility towards the nation and race. And that's a very interesting way of placing a discussion about ethics in these parameters. You know, the individual responsibility. How do I deal with that? Do I have to feel responsible towards future generation, towards society I live in? In what way can I sacrifice some of my individual liberties for the greater good? Do I need to do this and that because it's good for my family? All of these very profound, humane, and existential questions that all of us deal with on a daily basis. You know, how do you react to a particular instance or a situation? Well, very carefully placed, of course, in a big discussion about what was permitted, what was not permitted. How can you deal with it, you know, whether passively or actively accept that this is a given and either collaborate or be completely indifferent. And that's a serious discussion when it comes to historical responsibility, because we know most of the people basically were, you know, complacent and they did not interfere, they did not support, they did not fight when they saw atrocities happening, or they saw pogroms or happening, or they saw the deportations happening. They did not interfere. They were in a way believing that if the state tells them that this is for the greater good, it is acceptable. And if you look at Nazi Germany again, with this obsession, the Germans, the German Nazis, but overall German nationalists in a way and German racists had with this mission, they believe they have this mission of creating a new German nation after the First World War, where they were, of course, suffered tremendous defeat, and then they need to rejuvenate and recreate the new German Reich. It will be culturally, spiritually, but also racially homogeneous. And then eugenics came in very handily, as it were, because to achieve its goals, the state can use not only the knowledge provided by the scientists, but also the expertise, and in the way, the popularization of these ideas in the media, from films. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the horrific films the Nazis used to show in cinemas about, both about eugenics, but also about the Jews in terms of the racially stereotyping, the threat they represent. So it was a very complex edifice that fall into place, and it was built gradually until coercive measures such as sterilization of people who were hereditarily diseased became the law in 1933, applied in 1934. And it was followed by murder, of course. They call it euphemistically mercy killing or euthanasia. And then started with mentally disabled children, and then it included mentally and physically disabled adults. And of course, the official Nazi propaganda really worked non-stop, incessantly, to convince the people that we need to purify the race. Of Jews, of course, in first and foremost, but also other people, the Roma, the Sinti, the Afro-Germans, people who are not considered to be Nordic or type. So ultimately, the Holocaust offered that, what they call the final solution. But this was a final choreographed or carefully choreographed act in an unfolding and long racist and eugenic sort of utopia they've been building for a long time. I'm aware of my time, so I'll try to synthesize a bit, so I don't want to run over too much. I want to go back to medicine because this is the purpose of this panel today. I think medicine bears a great responsibility for the widespread influence of eugenics. Physicians, and of course we have the examples of the Nazi physicians, but if you look at the 1930s, East Central Europe, there were other physicians who were Nazi who also believed very strongly in these ideas, and they added medical credibility to the by then very popular view that we need to protect the society from the growing members of minorities, growing members of minorities such as the Jews, but also people they labeled unfit or feeble-minded or subnormal, and that was due to their disability. And they introduced measurements and tests. Now we know of those experiments in their horrific form because they were carried in concentration camps. But we have to understand that the entire structure of testing, measurement, experimentation, everything that the so-called scientists did there was actually the result of decades of practice already being informed and carried out in Europe and in Germany before the Nazi came to power. All of these measurements and tests and how to operate and how to think in this way was already there. What it wasn't there, of course, were the millions of people sacrificed for the purpose of this horrific and atrocious vision they had about the world. But the scientists would talk about this, and we see this during the trials in 1946, 1947. They were describing this as objective science. They were trying to find a solution to a medical problem or a scientific problem. And that's extremely difficult for us to accept. But they were coming from this scientific view, of course, that if you use science objectively, you are able to explain intellectual and development variations between individuals. Of course, even if that means that some people are stigmatized or marginalized and ultimately dehumanized, because this is what happened, you dehumanize their lives, the lives of people you control and supervise. And ultimately you think they represent a different, less able humanity. And before the war, they could be put in special schools and colonies in the ghettos. And after the war, during the war, you could put them in concentration camps and eliminate them. The only purpose they served in many ways, according to this worldview, was just for scientific experiments. I want to bring this point back to how I started. Sadly and very unfortunately, eugenics did not simply vanish after the Holocaust. It remained deeply embedded in post-World War II debates on education and social welfare, public health, and very importantly, human rights. Racial and social and cultural boundaries between eugenically valuable individuals and those considered otherwise remain solid and were often reinforced through legislation. And it's enough to think of countries such as the United States, which continue to sterilize people until the 1970s or 80s, or if you look at the Scandinavian countries, which also sterilized people until the 1970s. So you have non-totalitarian states practicing eugenics. And of course, I don't want to go into cases such as China or India, or even a country like Czechoslovakia, of course, who sterilized the Roma women in the 1970s and 80s. So it is a serious issue for us as scientists or people who work in the history of science, history of medicine. Why was it possible that eugenics continued to exert influence in medicine and biomedical thinking after 1945, considering how much it provided credibility to racist policies before and during the Holocaust? How was it possible to put the two things together, to write about human experiments conducted by the Nazis, and at the same time believe there is a possibility to save eugenics from its Nazi abuse? So we continue to ask ourselves, and I think conferences like as the one we are at the moment are important in this way, because we continue to ask, how could the Holocaust happen, and why? You know, how could millions of people tolerate and think, tolerate anti-Semitism and racism, and think along these eugenic hierarchies of the world in which some of the people are superior and the others are inferior, and they deserve to be eliminated? And the answers to these questions, of course, change over time. If we ask Leo Alexander in 1949, he would have had an answer, he had an answer. And they believed we can create the Nuremberg Code, and then everything, you know, we cannot continue or put into practice any human or medical experimentation without the consent of the person involved. They believe that maybe that's one way forward. In the 1970s and 80s, with new generations of people, other answers were provided. And of course, with the memory of the Holocaust changing over time, with very few survivors still left to actually share their testimonies and powerful experience, younger generation will find their own answers. But we have to keep asking these questions. We shouldn't treat eugenics in relation to the Holocaust or in relation to a Nazi period as a extraordinary episode, as something, an anomaly, which was different from the development of sciences. Because it wasn't. It was part of the scientific discussion. It was part of the scientific norm. It was also part of the global modernity in the 20th century, one in which the state and the individual embarked on an unprecedented quest, a quest that continues to this day. We could see this with the entire debate about everything from genetic screening to biotechnologies and human enhancement, a kind of future which the science can provide. So as we discuss the development of medical and legal ethics after the Holocaust, we continue ultimately to do another thing as well, which we fight for racial equality and social justice. We also fight for historical memory. And this is why, in my short presentation, I wanted to add something to this extraordinary debate. that we need to not forget about eugenics. We need to try to understand the past and also the present. And equally important, we must confront and expose the legacies of eugenics in order to move forward. And we can respect human rights, and we can respect and ensure there's no discrimination against people belonging to religious minorities or those living with disabilities. But ultimately healing the wounds, the deep wounds inflicted by what happened during the war, by the Holocaust, and by what eugenics did to people, requires a great deal of global recognition, public global recognition of those who are wronged, and we can prevent that's happening again in the future. And this, I hope, will set us on the pathway to develop new ways. We need new ways of critically engaging with these issues, of thinking and treating each other with dignity and respect. Thank you.